Hi guys, welcome back to the next part of our series. Today we're going to be talking about sculpting, and this is going to be a really fun chapter. Sculpting is one of those things in 3D that's very fun to do. So before we jump on to actually sculpting the first exercise, I do need to cover some of the basics. And I'm going to start actually by talking about the tablets, because we're going to be using our tablets in these chapters. If you've never used a tablet before, this is just a way to transfer some inputs from our fingers and from our pen into the softwares. And the good thing about tablets is that they have something called sensitivity. So depending on how hard you press on your tablet, you're going to get a different result. Now, I myself am using this Canvas 16 pen display, and I have access to all of these buttons over here. Usually, it really doesn't matter which tablet you're using, Wacom, Huion, XP Pen, there's a lot of brands nowadays. If you go up here, you can actually select what inputs you want for each specific software. In this case, for Huion, that's where you would find it, but I've used Wacoms before, and they work in a very similar fashion. So you can customize your buttons and your inputs depending on which software you're using. So for my tablet, since I'm gonna be using the tablet most of the time, I want to have a couple of things right here. I'm gonna have my F key right here, which is gonna control the size of my brush. I'm gonna have my shift, my control, and a control C right here. So as you can see, these are the four buttons that I'm mostly gonna be using. My hand's gonna be holding this side of the tablet, and I'm gonna be navigating with this ones right here. I actually do have a couple of other shortcuts here, but I don't use them as much. I usually use this ones over here. Very important, in your pen, you want one of your buttons to be your mouse middle button, and you want the other one to be your right button. Usually the click that you do is the normal left button. So very important. You can choose whichever you want. I personally like to have the middle mouse on the bottom side and the right mouse on the upper side. But again, you can do whatever works the best for you. Now, what is a sculpting? Well, we saw in the last chapter that one of the things that we're going to be doing when we're working in 3D is we're going to be modifying the components of an object, right? The faces, the edges, the vertices. Well, sculpting is nothing more than bringing that thing and pushing it all the way to 11. So we're going to be bringing all of that detail to ridiculous amounts of levels. What do I mean by this? Well, if I were to create a sphere right here, I'm going to press Shift A. Actually, let me toggle our Cardinal thing right here. So if I press Shift A and we go Mesh and say UV Sphere, we know that we have the sphere, and the sphere has X amount of divisions, right? 32 segments, 16 rings. That's fine. If I go up here to this little option, which is the overlays, there's one overlay that I can turn on, which is this statistics. I really like using this one. As you can see, it says you have 3 objects in the scene. You have 482 birds, 992 edges, 512 faces, 960 triangles. Perfect. That's very common. Now, the way sculpting works, I'm going to click this sculpting tab up here, and we're going to jump onto the sculpting menu, is we're going to be using all of these brushes over here, all of these elements, which by the way, you can move around. If you move them, you're going to see the names. I'm actually going to keep the names so that it's a little bit easier to find. Again, just moving this thing right here. And the way these brushes work is they're going to be modifying the vertices of the object, which it will translate, of course, to the modification of the edges and the faces. So right now, for instance, if I grab my pen and I'm in the draw brush and I draw across the surface, you're going to see that I'm pulling all of the faces there, all of the vertices upwards towards my camera, right? I'm gonna press the little button on my mouse and move it around, and this is how I'm gonna be toggling the camera. The movements are exactly the same: Shift and the middle mouse, Control and middle mouse. That's why I have middle mouse on that specific position on my pen. And yeah, there you go. So as you can see right here, we can pan and we can zoom. So by checking this out, just 1 second. There we go. By moving these things around, as you can see, we get this very nice or interesting effect. Rather than having to go and select all of this vertices, we can do this in a little bit more of an organic way. I'm going to press Ctrl C a couple of times. Oh, let me go back to Edit, Sculpting. We're going to go here to Sculpt Mode. There we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on symmetry. So for instance, if I go all the way up here to this X little thing here, we have symmetry. So if I start to pull and push the vertices and the faces on this side, you can see that's happening on both sides. As you can imagine, this is the way we sculpt characters. There are, of course, other softwares, but Blender has a really powerful sculpting tools that we're going to be using. The more I click or the more aggressive I go here in the transformation, you can see that the harder the vertices get pulled up towards the camera. Now there's a lot of different things, but as you you can see, we're not getting the best result right here. And the reason why we're not getting the best result is because sculpting works best when we have more components, more topology, right? So the more vertices that we have, the more control we're going to have over our sculpture. That has pros and cons, right? The pros is that, yes, we're going to be able to get a lot of detail. The cons is that it's going to become heavier, and sometimes you won't be able to use this specific objects for certain types of productions, such as video games, right? Like, you can't really take a multi-million polygon object into a video game and expect it to behave properly, because the performance won't really allow it. We'll take a look later on at how we're going to be optimizing things, but right now I just want to focus on the sculpting. So how can we add more topology? Well, we already know that if we were to go to the modifiers, we can add, for instance, a subdivision modifier, and the more divisions we add, let's have that we add 4 divisions right there. Let me turn on the statistics. There we go. The more divisions we add, especially if we apply them, I'm gonna hit this little arrow here and apply them to make this permanent. Now you can see that we no longer have 900 triangles. We have 126,000 faces, which is a lot. But that will allow me to, for instance, select this clay strip brushes and sculpt a lot more detail into our elements. See how nice those like bands look right there? This is what's going to allow me to create. And again, remember, the important thing about this basics of sculpting is when using a tablet, if you go really hard on your tablet, you're going to be doing super intense like changes right there. If you go really soft, you're going to be able to create these very nice soft transitions, which makes modeling and sculpting a lot more, I would say, natural, rather than having to calculate every single movement with faces and vertices. We can control this in a more natural way. It will definitely take a little bit of time. Sculpting is one of those things that it's a little bit difficult to teach, because I can't tell you exactly what to do or how hard I'm pushing. You're gonna have to feel it for yourself, and you're gonna have to explore the different things that you can do with the software. Now, a couple of shortcuts that you might need to know. First of all, when you are outside of the object, if you press Shift and a middle mouse, where you're gonna pan, and if you press Control and middle mouse, you're gonna zoom. If you just click anywhere or just click the middle mouse, you're gonna rotate around. So by doing these 3 clicks, you're gonna be able to move around the scene and observe the object from different angles. When you're inside the object, though, the shortcuts actually change. When you press Shift, you're gonna soften the object. So as you can see, it kind of blurs the detail that we just created, and it softens the whole transition. We're not adding more topology. We're gonna talk about that later. But right now, when we're doing this, we're actually not adding more topology. We're just moving and modifying the actual topology, the points and faces that we have on the object. So as you can see, if I just go over this whole thing a little bit strongly, I'm going to soften up all of the details that I had right there. And if you press Control, what's going to happen is you're going to do the opposite function of what your brush is currently doing. So by default, if you draw with, for instance, the clay strips, you can see that I'm adding sort of like clay strips on top. But if I press Control on top of the object and I draw, what's happening now is I'm removing volume. It's not that I'm deleting polygons or anything. I'm just pushing them down and creating this sort of like a hole right there on the geometry. Again, I can press Shift and smooth this out and pretty much erase it, or just Control C and go all the way back. Now, brushes are divided in 2 sections, and you can see them by the colors. It's the like the modification brushes, which are these blue ones. These are a little bit more of the more aggressive ones, I would say. As you can see, they're in this red color. The flatten brush I really like. I use this quite a bit. The shortcut, by the way, to make the size of the brush bigger is F. So if you go F and you click, that's going to be the new size. And the flatten brush, as you can see right there, it will flatten things. It will flatten things towards the point of the brush. As you can see that it's now flat. And if you do Control and do the same thing, it will flatten them towards the bottom part like that. So yeah, smooth brush, flatten. The fill brush, I really like the fill brush. It's a really aggressive brush as well, as you can see right there. But it gives this very interesting like flat effects as well. It's kind of like flattening everything to the normal of the selection that you have. So for instance, if I select that one right there and I start like drawing, we're gonna create a new plane based on that specific angle. Again, all of these things can be used to obtain different types of elements. The scrape brush, for instance, it's a little bit more like if you are from ZBrush, this it works a little bit more like the trim dynamics, like a bevel brush. So as you can see, it bevels the edges very nicely. So again, these are a little bit more I would say aggressive brushes. This one's right here a little bit more specialized. They have very cool effects. Grab is very common. We're going to be using this quite a bit, and as you can imagine, this just like moves and pushes the topology around. The elastic deform, it will allow you to do a little bit of a bendy effect. If you want like softer effects instead of the grab, that one works really well. Snake hook, this one's really like dangerous because it really destroys the geometry. You can see how all of this geometry gets destroyed. There's ways in which we're going to be able to rebuild that later on, but by default it tends to be very intense. The thumb brush is kind of like pushing with your thumb, so this is just to again get like a little bit more of a naturalistic kind of look. Notch brush, this one works like a cloth. As you can see, it's a little bit like not as smooth. It takes a little bit longer. If we had more density, you would see this behave a little bit more like cloth. The rotate one, this one's very fun. This one allows you to, it doesn't seem to be doing much right now, but it will create this sort of when you grab like a piece of cloth and you rotate it around its axis and you create like those wrinkles. I believe we do need a little bit more geometry right now. So again, there's a lot of different brushes that we're going to be able to use. In the very first lessons, we're only going to be working with this ones right here. But as you saw right now, it is a little bit like tricky to go into the modifiers and work with a subdivision modifier, because imagine if we wanted to add more detail. Maybe we want to draw something here on the top of the sphere, right? I don't know, like a blender or something. If I try to write the word blender, as you can see, the topology is still really low to get to that sort of like super fine detail. So how can we get to the finer detail? Well, we need more subdivisions. We need more than 126,000 faces. And there's another modifier that works really, really well when working with sculpting, which is this multi-resolution modifier. So if we click that one right there, you can see that we have options right here. We have sculpt subdivisions, level viewport subdivisions, and render subdivisions. So what I can say is I can say subdivide right here. I'm gonna do once, two, okay, and now when I do two, now we're at 2 million polygons, as you can see right here. And when we're at 2 million polygons, I'm gonna be able to write and get a lot more detail here on my sphere. Usually, I mean, it depends on the characters, right? But it is very common to be working with really, really high levels of subdivision levels or geometry. But it will be very difficult to go back to the layout. And imagine we wanted to animate this thing with 2 million polygons. It's way, way too much. That's why the multi-resolution modifier works so well. Because as you can see right here, when we sculpt and when we render, we're going to be seeing the full resolution, the 2 million polygons. But when we're in the viewport, like right now, we're going to be seeing the base level viewport effect. So it's going to run very smoothly. We're going to be able to work and modify it, maybe even animate it and stuff. And when we go back to sculpting, we're going to be seeing the 2 million polygons, 4.5 million vertices right here that we're going to be using for this sort of effect. So multi-resolution is one way to do it. I really like working with that one. We're actually going to be doing one exercise with multi-resolution next. But there's one more that we're going to be using quite a bit, which is called the remesher. Again, if you're familiar with other software such as ZBrush, this works a little bit like Dynamesh. So remesh is a way in which we can recalculate the volume of the object and then generate a new topology that's going to be uniform across the whole object, and it will hold a specific amount of density, right? You can see right here this voxel size, it's set to 0.1, which means that if I were to remesh this thing, which is not going to let me unless we apply this, so I'm going to apply this right here, or just delete it. There we go. So if I go remesh and I remesh right here, you can see everything got recalculated. It created new polygons, new triangles, new everything, and it reformed or recreated the shape of our sphere right here. Now we're only at 2,000 faces, but as you can see, we lost a lot of the form, right? Well, if I hit Control C and I go here to remesh and I bring the voxel size down to something like 0.01, for instance, and I hit remesh, now we're still gonna remesh, but now the shape is looking a lot better. We are now at 200,000, which is quite nice. And since the topology changed and it's a little bit more uniform, I'm actually gonna be able to write here with a little bit more precision. So this is a great way to create base meshes that we can work with without having to worry about topology and just focusing on sculpting. However, just be careful, because the more you go, like, or the lower you go, for instance, if we go 0.005 and I hit remesh, it's going to take a little while, but as you can see, now we're at almost 1 million polygons. And the problem with this one, this is the main problem about using remesh. Yes, this is going to look a little bit better. As you can see, we got more detail, more resolution. But if we go back to layout, there's no subdivision levels. We're still seeing everything at the highest subdivision, the almost 1 million points. So performance-wise, it can get quite tricky. Unfortunately, Blender is not, it is quite optimized, but it has a little bit of issues working with super high density polygons. So I'm going to show you some techniques that we can use to get around that sort of limit that we tend to have. But yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. That's the basics of sculpting. We're going to be using this workspace right here. We're going to be using all of these brushes. We're going to be using our tablets, the navigation that I just mentioned. And depending on the types of model that we're using, we're either going to be using remeshing to generate more geometry, or we're going to be using the traditional subdivision method. There's another one we'll talk about later, which is called Dynotopo, or Dynotopo. It's this one right here. But that one's a little bit more specialized, and it's really good, but it's quite heavy. So I'll explain how that works later on. That's it for this one, guys. If you want, I would strongly recommend you try to do like just a basic exploration here of the tools so that you feel comfortable with them, because on the next one we're going to start working on an actual exercise. So hang on tight, and I'll see you back on the next one. Bye bye. Hey guys, welcome back to the next part of our series. Today we're going to continue exploring the sculpting workflow, and what better way to do it than using our very trusty barrel right here. So I just opened the old barrel scene, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save this as, and we're going to save this as barrel sculpt. We're going to save this. That way we're not modifying the original, and we have a backup in case we need to do anything later on. So as you know, we have a couple of things here in the scene, like the camera, the lights, and stuff like that. So I'm going to turn all of them off. We don't really need to see them. And I actually just want to focus on the main wood barrel. So going here to the barrel, we can actually turn off the bolts and the rings. I'm going to select the object right here, and we're going to jump into sculpting. And now we're ready to start sculpting. If we try to sculpt, of course, like using, for instance, the draw material right there, or the knife brush, you can see that we're not really doing anything. And the reason we're not really doing anything is because this is actually a modifier. We use the subdivision modifier, and if we turn this off, you're gonna see that the barrel is actually quite low poly. So there's no points that we're like pushing from one point to the other. If we take a look at the resolution that we have right here, it's not a bad resolution, but it's not the best for what's the word, for or for sculpting either. So right now I don't want to worry about retopology or topology in general. I'll talk about that later once we get into the character and why that is important. We're just going to focus on creating a very nice sculpt here for this barrel. So I am going to keep this on, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the transformation so that this is now the base that we have for our barrel. And we're now going to go into remesh, and let's use a 0.01 voxel size and hit a remesh. Now, as you can see, it does look okay. Let's turn off our overlay here with the statistics. But I think we can go a little bit higher, because as you can see, we do get a little bit of the faces still. So another thing we could do is we could add another modifier, like another subdivision modifier first. So let's subdivide this twice and say apply. So now as you can see, we're at 54,000. And when we hit remesh at 0.01, it should be the same, but we shouldn't get the bands that we had. See that? So we're now at 1,000 faces, but now we don't have the weird banding. Why? Because we still had the smooth shade. Remember when we were in layout mode and we right click, we still had the shade smooth. So even though it looked really round, it wasn't round. The polygons were still a little bit obvious there, and that's why when we remesh, it tried to keep those elements as normal as possible. Now you probably saw a little like warning that we got down there saying that the uniform or the scale is not uniform. That's very important. If you remember, every single object has proportions, right? And the scale right now, we actually scaled this thing a little bit. We need to apply those proportions. Remember how we talked about freezing the transformations? So I'm going to hit Control A, and I'm going to say transform all transforms. That way our scale is set to 1. Now we go back to sculpting, and as you can see, we can very nicely sculpt right here. I'm going to turn on my Symmetry X option so that we can see where we start. And the first thing I want to do is I want to do the bars, right? Like the wooden bars that we would normally get. So I'm going to use my knife brush here, or this is called I think it's called the Sharp Draw or something. There we go, Draw Sharp. And I'm going to make this thing a little bit smaller. And I'm going to start drawing my lines like this. Now, when you're doing this, you need to try and keep your like line as consistent as possible. I think this is really weird. I'm not feeling my what's the word? Yeah, so I'm trying to use my pressure on the brush, and I'm not really feeling it. let me see if it's because, no, there's no modifier. Okay, so there's a, this is particularly for me, but there's a small little bug here where sometimes certain softwares won't behave as properly. Let me solve this real quick. Give me just 1 second. Very well. The guilty one, by the way, is Photoshop. Photoshop is the, what's the word? It's the software that breaks everything, and it kind of breaks it because it, what's the word? It forgets it doesn't need to use like Windows Ink. It's some sort of like a, what's the word? Driver issue. It's some driver issue. But don't worry, in this case I just closed it, open up again. As you can see now, my sensitivity is back in order. So I'm gonna turn on again a symmetry in X. I'm gonna make the brush a little bit bigger, and I'm gonna start marking where these lines are gonna go. And very, very calmly, I'm gonna start pushing them to carve in the sort of like plates that I would expect to have on the wood, like that. So that looks okay. I'm trying to think about how many I want. Probably one more here. Trying to go into a nice like perspective view so that the thing becomes as nice as possible. There we go. We can make the brush a little bit smaller to have like a sharper edge right there. Very important here on the borders. We're actually gonna push them as well, like this. We might need to soften them up a little bit and then push them. Now, we don't have a lot of geometry. It might seem like we have a lot of geometry because we're being able to draw that, but 85,000 polygons is not that much. So I'm actually going to go a little bit higher. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to say 0.05 and hit remesh. 0.005 and hit remesh. The amount of voxel size that you will need depends on a couple of variables. First, it depends on the size of your object, because the voxel size is a universal sort of scale. So certain objects might need a smaller voxel size if they're really, really small, and some of them might need a bigger voxel size if they're really, really big. So for instance, if you're doing like a huge building or something, you might need like a 5 voxel size or something like that. And if you're doing like a small like toy car, like what we did before, you might need a smaller size. Also keep in mind that Blender will use a lot of resources for this sort of operations, so having more voxels will definitely be more demanding for your computer. I've heard some people that, depending on their computer, they can't work above like 2 million like points. It will all depend on how much memory and processor power you have. So there we go. So again, we're using the draw sharp to create this very, very nice effect. Now we're going here towards the inside. Let's push that a little bit more. Probably gonna have like 2 more like that. So some of the planks are gonna be quite big, and some of the planks are gonna be a little bit small. As you can see, I'm not being super careful. I kind of want to give this sort of like very organic, stylized vibe. So my lines don't need to be super clean. Like having this sort of like animated effect. There we go. Now, how can we add more detail? Well, imagine this is like some sort of like forest barrel, right? Like someone built it with wood that they had like laying around, and it might not be the perfect wood. It might not be like a super smooth wood. It's just like chunks of wood. Well, we can use the clay strips. I love using the clay strips. It's one of my favorite brushes to create this sort of like wood effect. Look at that. So we're kind of like creating the grains of the wood. Now, be very gentle here when applying this sort of like texture, because we don't want to go over the rings. Remember that we have some rings over here. You can actually turn them on. But if we turn the rings on, there's a couple of things that are going to happen. First of all, when we go across the rings like that, they act as a mask. So you won't be able to see what's underneath, even though you are pushing some of the elements. So just be careful there, okay? That's why I was mentioning that we need to be kind of soft here. Well, we can go crazy and create like this sort of like twisting and then moving elements for our barrel. Something like that looks nice. go here. Now, for instance, up here, maybe we want some of the wood elements to go a little bit above the line, right? Like they're, again, a little bit more gnarly looking woods. So we had something like that. And at any point, we can go back to the draw sharp, for instance, and say, hey, you know what? We kind of want to add some details to those woods, right? Maybe to this one as well. Just be careful on the symmetry, because it can be a little bit noticeable. What's the word? These things are gonna like hide it quite a bit, like the eventual rings that we have. But there we go. Let's add this very, very cool texture. And 350,000 polygons, it's not bad for a high poly. This is what we would normally call a high poly in production. And this high poly would eventually need to go through a process called retopology, where we prepare it to be able to use it inside of a commercial, or like a film, or like a game, right? Because game engines nowadays are really strong. Unreal Engine is quite nice, but we still need to keep things under control. You can't go crazy. Imagine having like a wine cellar with 100 of these guys. You would have like a stupid amount of polygons. So that's why it's very, very important to optimize things when you can. Now, if you're thinking about using this for 3D print, then go ahead. This is perfectly ready for 3D print. As long as the slicer that you're going to be using supports it, you're going to be able to 3D print, and all of this detail that you're seeing and that we're sculpting right now will be translated to the final 3D print. Might not be a bad idea to 3D print this little guy right here, to be honest. Might be fun. So there you go. We keep adding this sort of like wood texture. Again, as I mentioned, I really like the clay tubes or clay strips because they give me this very nice organic, natural looking texture. Play around with the pressure. As you can see, some of the stripes that I'm placing are a little bit like denser or higher, and some of them are a little bit more controlled. And there we go. So now this looks like bark, right? It's starting to look a little bit like bark. This would be a good moment to drop the X symmetry, go back into the draw stripe, and start adding some of the details that we might expect. So for instance, what about like a knot? Like maybe here, have a little bit of a knot. So let's draw the knot. Let's make this even thinner, so we can create this sort of effect. And if we need to go over some of the lines to separate the elements again, we can do that. You can also go, I really like using the scrape one. Remember, we mentioned this one on the last video, to flatten certain areas. So maybe certain parts of the wood are not as like dense and they're a little bit flatter. So see how nice this effect is becoming here on the barrel. Now you can also create the renders with this, by the way. You don't need to retopologize or anything. You just throw in the basic material, and just by the fact that we have like a little bit more complexity here and there, we're gonna be able to generate something a little bit interesting. Now up here, we definitely need to draw this. I am gonna turn on my symmetry again to make this thing a little bit easier. I'm gonna make my brush smaller. First, I'm gonna go around, kind of to create like the lid of the barrel, like this. And then let's go and create like the... I don't like that one. Remember, we also have the camera, so I can press this one right here, the C, and go to top view. And it's gonna allow me to create lines that are a little bit straighter. Let's have one line right down the middle. And then one line right here. And there we go. There's one very cool brush that I suggest you guys use. It's called the pinch, this one right here. It will bring polygons closer together. It's really, really powerful. And especially when you want to create like really sharp lines, like up here on the element, I think this one is a great option. So as you can see, we are pushing the elements together, and that gives us a sharper effect. Do we need to add those to the bottom part? I mean, if you want to. If you're not going to see the bottom part, there's a general rule that we tend to follow, which is if you don't see it, you don't model it. And the main reason is you don't want to waste time that you can invest somewhere else on places of your model that you're not going to be seeing as much. So yeah, we just keep adding some details here. Just going over some of the lines from the wood For instance, we can add some of the details here, especially here on the border. We can add those sort of like cuts that you would expect, especially if it's like an old wood. Some scratches maybe. Again, when you're adding details, try to get rid of symmetry. So maybe we can add like a couple of scratches here and there on the wood. Now let's turn on the these things right here so that we can see how they're like interacting with each other. And overall, I would say it looks quite nice. As you can see right here, it's not bad, right? Now remember, we're using, I think I did show you the environment, right? Like we are using an environment lights from the original scene. So you can see the reflections there on the barrel, even though we're not seeing the barrel. If you go to Eevee, we are gonna see this thing in a more interesting way with all of the materials and stuff, which looks quite nice. And of course, if we were to go, let me just say real quick before anything bad happens. If we go here to the renderer, which is we're using, remember, cycles, you can see how this environment is affecting us. Let's bring the intensity of the environment all the way back to 1 so that we can see it clearer. And there we go. So this would be the barrel that we would see on our scene. Technically, we can still sculpt right now, like here. It's not going to be efficient, of course, because there's a lot of processes going on, so I don't recommend doing it. But if it's a small, like simple scene, you might be able to get away with it. Now, let's go to the elements right here, to the rings. And as you can see, when we have the barrel selected and we're in sculpting mode, that means that we're sculpting barrels. If I try to sculpt on top of the rings, nothing is happening, right? Well, if I jump onto the rings now, I need to change this to sculpting, see, by clicking right there. So by clicking that option right there, now we're in sculpt mode. You can also change it over here on this mode. So when we go back to the barrel, you can see that, again, we're in sculpt mode, but you just need to click this to make this the active element that we're sculpting in. So we're going to jump into this rings right here real quick. Give me just 1 second. And now what I'm going to do is I just want to kind of like hammer. Have you seen those like hammered metals that you sometimes get in this sort of like fantasy games? So I'm going to go into the rings. They're in sculpt mode now, but we need to remember, we need to apply this thing. So I'm going to apply this. And if we were to remesh these things again, let's try like a 0.05 and hit a remesh. That's too low. That's too low. So we need to go a little bit higher. Let's go 0.005 and hit remesh. And let's see how high they go. Okay, that's a little bit better. We still get a little bit of that sort of like fragmentation, but you can see now, this is what I was talking about when talking about the proportions. You can see now that the amount of vertices is quite high because, well, we have a lot of objects now. Each ring right here has a certain amount of polygons, and the remesh took a little bit longer. So be very careful when increasing the remeshing process, because it will definitely affect the way it will behave. I'm gonna make this thing a little bit bigger, and what I'm gonna do, as I mentioned, so I'm just gonna start creating some sort of like bevels in certain areas of the element. See those like little dents here and there to signify that this barrel has some tough days, right? Maybe it's on a, again, like on a cellar, and it's been like pushed and has stumbled around a couple of other barrels. When adding details, you don't want to add details everywhere. You always want to be mindful of where details are. We'll talk about this once we get into texture as well. But it's always good to add a little bit of history to the object. You need to think about what kind of story am I telling when I'm doing this sort of stuff, right? So again, if I'm adding this sort of like damages here on the metal, I'm pretty much saying, hey, this thing has bumped into other things at some point of its life. So you can see I went a little bit harder over there. Let's keep it nice and simple, especially since we're going for the stylized, cartoony fantasy look. I think this one it's gonna work quite nice. You can see there's a little bit of overlap between the wood and the rings. I don't think that's a big issue, but if we want, we could of course go back to what's the word, to the viewport option, to the object option, just push the rings out a little bit more, even after we're done with these things. I'm again not particularly bothered by them or by it. I think it looks interesting, but it could be something that we can add. And now let's go to the draw, for instance, or to the draw sharp. Let's go for a really small brush, and I just want to add like a couple of like scratches, especially following like some of the ones that we have on the barrel, kind of like to make sense that that they kind of like hit the barrel. Like this one, see this like really big one, So let's add one big hit right there, and that makes it that brings everything together, right? It makes it seem like everything's part of the same element. And there we go. Now we can bring the little spheres back. Let's go to the bolts. And the bolts, they don't have a modifier. So what we can do here, I'm actually going to use a multi-resolution for this ones. And I'm going to subdivide this a couple of times. This means that these are not being, remember, these are not being, what's the word? They're not being remeshed. We're not going to remesh them. We're going to use the original topology that they have. Now, there are a lot of them, and they had quite a bit of geometry before we started, so hopefully this doesn't crash. But what we're expecting here is we're expecting to get a, whatever we had, double the amount, or 4 times the amount. So give me just 1 second. Let me wait for this to recover. Very well, so we're back here, and it didn't crash, which is great. But you can see here that we have a lot of polygons. It seems like this subdivision brought it like quite high. Now you can see that we have a lot of vertices. But as long as my computer can hold it, I'll show you. If this is way too much, you can go back to the remesh and work with that one. What I pretty much want to do here is I want to use the scrape brush to, again, just give the spheres. Let's turn on this sculpting option for the bolts. There we go. Sculpt mode, bolts. There we go. And now I just want to, again, like kind of like if they were hammered in, right? So it's just a little bit of extra detail that I want to add here. Just damage them a little bit and create something that looks a little bit more interesting than just like regular spheres. For instance, this one, I can really hit it right there. You can see that's quite flat. You can also increase the strength on the brush over here. Like I'm gonna go to 1, so that I'm a lot like stronger here on the effect. It's gonna allow me to move a little bit faster. I'm also gonna make the brush bigger. The size of the brush and the pressure of the brush affect everything quite a bit, so make sure to keep that in mind when creating your sculptures. There we go. Again, this is definitely a little bit too much polygons. I'll probably try to keep this a little bit lower, but for the sake of explanation, I think it looks quite nice. Now, the sculpting process definitely takes a lot of time. I have a lot of experience in sculpting. I've been doing this for the past 11, 12 years. But as you can see, there's like details that we're missing, like especially like up here. So let me go back to the barrel. Let's turn on sculpt mode again. Let's draw sharp. And sculpting is all about the details, right? Like you want to have great forms, like when we modeled the barrel in the first chapters. And once we have that, you want to make sure that that translates into all of the details that we're going to be adding. So see how we're missing some of the lines right here? It's something that we can't afford. We definitely need to have all of this like details right here, so that when our audience or the clients see this, they love it. Up here, we're also missing some details, so let's... I don't have symmetry turned on right now, which is fine. It's gonna give me a little bit more of an organic look. And as with everything, the more time we invest into something, the better it's gonna get. Right now, we've been working on this thing for, wow, 22 minutes. I'm actually running a little bit longer than usual, but I want to keep everything on the same video, so I'm not gonna cut this or edit this out. I just want to make sure you guys see the whole thing. So there we go. Let's go back to the layout mode, and now we can again turn on our environment, and we can even turn everything back on, like the camera and the lights. And this will be a completely different render to what we had before, right? This is gonna look a lot better. I'm actually gonna get a render real quick. Let me just make sure that we're using GPU. Yeah, so I'm gonna hit render. Let's put a time limit of like 15 seconds. Render and render image. Now, what we just covered, guys, is the workflow that we're going to be using for sculpting. We're going to create a base mesh or a base object that we can start sculpting from, and then we're going to start adding some details, adding some forms, modifying some of the elements that come with it, and little by little, we're going to be creating the whole composition. Let me just see if we can get this render real quick. Oh, come on, Blender. the thing is, we have a lot of polygons. That's why this render is going to take a little bit longer. So I'm going to do this off camera, guys. Give me just 1 second, or not just 1 second. On the next video, I'll show you the result of the render, and then we'll keep on going with the next exercise. Make sure to get to this point. If you can get a render, that's great. And I'll see you back on the next one. Bye-bye. Hey guys, welcome back to the next part of our series. Today we're going to continue with primary forms, and I'm using this software called Krita. I think I've mentioned this one before. It's a free software. It's pretty cool. So let me just grab this guy right here. Today we're going to be doing a skull. It's one of the most common things that we do. Let's try this. There we go. It's one of the most common exercises to do when learning about sculpting, and we're going to be doing a little bit of a stylized sculpt, as you can see right here. So this is some of the examples. However, when talking about sculpting, one of the things that I want to make sure you guys learn is that you can't just rely on inspiration or on motivation and things like that. You need to create or have something called a process. We need to follow a series of steps in order for us to get to a specific point that we might be looking for. In this case, the specific workflow that we're going to be using consists of 3 main steps, and today we're going to be talking about the primary forms. So primary forms are those forms that, as the name implies, are the most important forms of the object. So if we take, for instance, this guy right here, I would say that the primary form is this sort of a round shape around the whole thing, and then we have this sort of wedge thing right here, which is the upper jaw, right? Of course, we have other things like the eye sockets and the nose and stuff. I would probably include the eyes into the main shapes, and even the nose. And this right here, this is the shape that we want to create. This is the shape that we want to get to before we start adding any sort of details or wrinkles, or in this case, cracks and stuff like that. So now that we know, or now that we have a very clear goal in mind, let's jump into Blender. Here inside the Blender, we're of course going to delete our cube, and I'm going to start by creating a mesh, a sphere. So mesh and UV sphere right here. I definitely want to give it a couple of subdivisions. So I'm going to go here. Let's subdivide this guy a couple of times and apply this. So this is now the the final proportions for our element. And just like this, we're going to jump into our sculpting mode. So we just jump into sculpting mode, and we're ready to sculpt. Let's turn on X symmetry, very important. And let's start moving our sphere so that we can create our basic shapes. So again, when talking about basic shapes, one of the things that we want is we want to create the main silhouette of our character. In this case, I'm going to grab my grab brush, this one right here. I'm going to make my brush bigger, like that. And I'm going to start pushing this around, because we tend to think about the skull as this sort of really round thing, but it's actually more like an oval kind of shape. So going to the back right here, we're going to do that, and then going to the front, we're going to just push this thing forward, and think about creating a sort of a triangular looking shape, something like this. You can of course go into the different cameras if you want to go to front, side, and that sort of views, but it's very important that you rotate your model around when we're working on any kind of sculpting, so that you can appreciate it from all of the different angles. Okay, so right now it looks fine. I'm gonna go now to my draw brush. I'm gonna make it a lot smaller, something like that, and let's draw a middle line. So I'm gonna use a control and just carve in a middle line that represents the center of the face, and then another middle line that represents the other center of the face, like this. And this is just to in order for me to observe properly where things are supposed to be. We can go now to the clay tubes or clay strips right here. Gonna make it slightly bigger, and we're using control to carve in where I would expect the eyes to be, because I would definitely say that the eyes are one of those things that are essential to the character. So something like that. That looks good. Oh, let's keep subtracting a little bit there. There we go. I'm gonna make the brush slightly smaller, and I'm gonna easily or very fastly, or fast, is that the proper word? In a quick way, I'm just going to mark where I would expect the nose to be. Make sure that the proportions look good. And again, we've only used 3 brushes right now. The move brush to get the general shape, and now this clay brush to start pushing things around. Cool. Now, one thing that you might see is that the topology or the density of the element, we're struggling, right? And we're seeing some of the polygons break, and we see this very jaggedy edge here on the character. And that, of course, is due to the fact that we don't have enough resolution. We've talked about this Sorry, we talked about this before, and we need to go to remesh and say, hey, you know what? Let's remesh to 0.1. Let's see how this looks at 0.1. 0.1 is not good at all, so let's go 10 times that. So we're gonna say 0.01 and hit remesh. There we go, that looks a little bit better. Let's of course go over here and save our statistics, or turn on our statistics. 200,000 points or faces should be more than enough for this initial stages. And that's the first advice that I want to give everyone who's starting into the sculpting world. Never ever ever go higher than what you need at the moment, right? So if we're not doing cracks or specific like little details, you don't need to have as much resolution. It becomes a lot harder to work with a lot of polygons. So if you do this gradually, if you start subdividing or adding more resolution when you need it, it's gonna make your life so much easier. Now I'm gonna grab again my clay strips, and let's start like creating a little bit of form right here. So if we go back to our reference, we're gonna see that the nose actually goes forward, right? Like it's not like flat to the skull. It's actually gonna be going forward. So first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab this clay tubes right here, and I'm gonna add a little bit of volume right there to fill in that gap, because we're not supposed to have a gap. Now, since we're gonna be doing a big change, one of the best advices I can give you is, with big changes, use big brushes. That's a really nice rule of thumb. So in this case, I'm going to use my grab brush. As you can see, I'm not scared of really pushing this thing all the way forward to create the proper depth that we need here. If I see that things start becoming a little bit like weird, no worries. I can press Shift and smooth this out to start cleaning up some of the shapes right there. Now I know, again, based on the reference and some previous knowledge that I have, that there's usually like a little bit of a ramp right there at the side of the character. So I'm gonna go back to my clay strips brush, make it a little bit smaller, and with Control, we're gonna start removing some of the volume that we have right here, so that the nose stays pretty much like a flat surface, right? It's pretty much like a square. You can see like the planes is top part and side parts right there. So we carve out some of this volume right here. And since we softened the eyes a little bit too much, I think we can carve them in again a little bit more. There's a very important feature in the skull, which is this thing called the Psychomatic Arc. It's this sort of like shelf that we have here at the side of the face. So I'm going to use again my clay strips. I love this brush because it allows me to block in shapes very quickly. I'm going to use this to add that little bit of volume all on this side. It's kind of like a pillow. So as you can see, especially if you see the side view right there, you can see how it pushes out. Now see this thing right here? Definitely need to push it in. So let's push it in over here. And that's gonna allow us to also create the main shape of the eyes right there. Cool. Now this shelf right here goes towards the ear with this direction. We can now, since we now have a better like understanding of the proportions, we no longer need this thing right here, so we can fill it in. And I know, again, based on the reference, that we have the eyebrows, right, like the brow. So we can start using again our clay strips, adding a little bit of the eyebrows right there, or the brows. On the side of the head, right around here, there's actually going to be a little bit of a hollow shape. This is where the temporal bone is, and over here is the frontal bone. So all of this here, we're going to have a little bit of a ridge. I'm going to add it. And there we go. So as you can see, by just subtracting and adding volume to the whole shape, we're not adding more polygons, we're not changing the proportions. We're already getting something that looks interesting. I wouldn't say this is finished, of course, but we are working on the primary forms of the thing. Now, one of the things that's really bugging me is the fact that this sort of like a jaw shape is completely wrong over here. So let's go back to our grab brush. Let's go back to a big brush. And let's start pushing and pulling the forms so that we can properly capture those shapes. I'm gonna push this thing in like this. See that? That's looking a little bit better. And let's push it out, because usually the mouth is actually like protruding outwards a little bit more. So I'm gonna push this out a little bit more. We wanna create this sort of like U shape, which is where the teeth are gonna be they're gonna be attached to later on. Let's make the brush a little bit bigger so we can move this a little bit faster. And all of this mass, we don't have it. This mass does not exist on the skull. So again, with our grab brush, we're just pushing this mass all the way back. I'm gonna go to my side view right here. You can see that this looks a little bit too alien. So let's grab a bigger grab brush Just start moving this until we get like a proper human-like shape. That's why I was mentioning that it's very important that we do this basic shapes first, and then we're gonna jump onto the more specific details. This thing's a little bit too low, so let's bring it up. Usually the skulls are usually sad, by the way, when you see like a human skull, but this one, let's make it like angry. So let's start creating the sort of shapes there that we need for this thing. Let's make sure that it looks good from the side. Again, we have a lot of volume here that we don't need, so let's go to our clay strips and just remove some of this volume. We carve this out. And there we go. If you don't like this, sort of like a damaged effect over there, just press shift, remember, and we're gonna soften this up. And once we do this, we can actually go back to remesh, and we can remesh again. By the way, the shortcut to remesh is Control R. And if you hit Control R, you're just gonna get like a new remesh. I'm gonna use this one. I really like using the scrape brush. Remember, this flattens things out, and it allows me to keep things like a little bit more, like a little bit cleaner, I would say. So as you can see, that really sharpens some of the edges as well, which is really good for this sort of like stylized effect that we're going for. I'm gonna grab my my grab brush again, make this bigger, and push this back so that we can see the whole, like the whole teeth section. I think my nose might be a little bit too big, and we're missing kind of like the nose going in there. There we go. So the nose kind of goes in there a little bit, and then it goes out. Again, I think it's a little bit too big, so let's fix it there a little bit. And there we go. Again, we're doing this sort of like blocking stage. Primary forms, the most important thing is making sure that the basic shapes are looking good. I always like to use the analogy of a cake, right? So when you're baking a cake, or when you see a cake on a party or on a wedding or something, yes, it looks very, very beautiful with all the decorations, but at the end of the day, you're gonna eat it, right? So it's not just there for decoration. You wanna taste it. And even if it looks super, super pretty, if the flavor or the bread tastes horrible, then you're gonna have a bad impression about the cake. The same thing happens with sculpting. When you're sculpting, sometimes we focus too much on like the details and the cracks and all of the minute like little effects that we're gonna be adding later on. But the most important thing, it's actually not that. It's actually the forms. If we manage to properly capture the base forms like what we're doing right here, we're gonna be closer to having a successful piece than if we focus too much on the details. I'm gonna grab my sculpt mode, my scrape again, and we're gonna flatten all of this thing over here. It's also gonna give me this sort of like hammered, stylized look on the back of the skull. See how nice we get those interesting edges. It's gonna clean some of the shape as well. And there we go. One thing that can get definitely a little bit tricky here inside the Blender is the fact that we are working with a perspective camera. So if you like zoom in, things are gonna get distorted. If you zoom out, things are gonna be a little bit like flatter. So make sure to, at the same time that you're rotating and looking around, make sure to also check around with the with the zoom, like zoom in and zoom out, to make sure that the proportions and everything is looking nice. I'm gonna go back to my in this case is the draw sharp, and just to divide this, I'm gonna just divide the eyebrows from the main shape right there. I'm gonna go back to my clay strips, and we're gonna remove a little bit of the nose right there. And there we go. We have successfully created all of the basic shapes for our skull. Of course, there's a lot of things that we're still missing. We're going to continue working on this exercise in the next couple of videos. But so far, what you need to make sure you have are the holes for the eyes, a little bit of the forms here on the top part, on the Psychomatic Arc, around the jaw, like this sort of like U shape for the teeth where we're going to have them, and of course the main shape. Make sure to save this. Remember that every single 3D software tends to be unstable sometimes, so make sure to save frequently so that you don't miss any of your work. And that's it for this one, guys. I'll see you back on the next one. Bye bye. Hey guys, welcome back to the next part of our series. Today we're going to continue with the secondary forms of our skull, and now is the time that we can start focusing a little bit more on the detail. By the way, there's a very cool software as well. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this one before on this series, but it's called PureRef. You can get this one for free. It's written PureRef as in reference, and if you copy and paste something, it's just like another board that you can have for easy access. If you have two monitors, it really helps because you can see one of the compositions in one of the monitors and then work on the other one. So that's exactly what I'm going to be doing right here. I'm going to be grabbing this guy right here, and we're going to start focusing on some of the shapes that we have for our character. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make the eyes a little bit deeper. Whenever we analyze an image, the lights and the shadows of the image, ignoring the colors, are the ones that should give us how much we should push something. So as you can see right here, there's a very sharp line from the nose towards the eye cavity, especially on this stylized sculptures. And mine right now, it's a little bit too soft. So what I can do right here is again go with my clay strips right here, make them a little bit smaller, and just use Control to carve in that division. Okay. So we're carving that division, and that way we leave a deeper, or we create a deeper effect here on the eyes. You can go as crazy as you want, but I would suggest keeping it sort of realistic. And now we can, of course, smooth the inside so that we don't lose all of this detail. On this outside part, we also get this sort of like a ridge on the eye. So there will be a little bit of a border right here, pretty much joining or combining with the Psychomatic Arc. And then here, the Psychomatic Arc, right beneath it, there's actually like a hollow thing, or a hollow section. So again, we're going to make our brush a little bit bigger, and we're going to start carving in this section right here, which this section, of course, is going to be going towards the teeth. So as you can see, that already gives us a nicer effect. The Psychomatic Arc actually doesn't flow this way, it flows towards the eye. So all of this tends to be quite flat as well. I'm going to grab my Control again. I'm just going to start carving out this section right here. It's kind of like a ramp. Later on, when we do the face for the gladiator, I'm going to show you something called the, The nasolabial fold, which is a very important fold that we get on faces. And it's right there. It follows this sort of line. That's why it gets formed, because the Psychomatic pushes towards the eye, and the rest of the element pushes down. So let's soften all of this. And now we can start adding a little bit of a ridge to the nose as well. It's very important that you understand the reason why we're following this process. In the first video, I mentioned that whenever we're doing something, whenever we're working on a project, we can't just rely on inspiration. We need to have a process, a series of steps that we know that if we follow, we're going to be able to get the result that we want. Let's push this thing a little bit higher. There we go. And now we need to create a little ridge on the inside. That's definitely going to require a little bit more geometry, but I'm going to see if we can do it with clay strips. At least a small indication. Yeah, that looks good. We can carve at the side a little bit, just smooth out. Just a small indication there. I think that looks nice. Now on the side, as I mentioned, there's usually a little bit of there's like a deep like changing planes right here. So I'm really gonna go here a little bit more intense. Actually, there's a hole in here, like in the usual skull. You're gonna see a hole, which is where the mandible attaches to. But right now we're not gonna be adding that. So we're just gonna carve in here, carving there a little bit more with our clay strips, and there we go. There we go. Don't be afraid to change brushes. Let's go, for instance, for like Draw Sharp, and really create that nice effect right there. I know we're gonna need to polish this. We're in need of more geometry, of more topology, but I don't want to bring the whole like a skull to a higher level just yet. It's very important, as I mentioned in the last video, that we wait until the very last moment where we really need that sort of detail before we do it. Because once we do it, it's going to be a little bit difficult. But to start with, we can't go back on remeasure. We're going to lose detail. So, and as I mentioned before, it becomes a little bit more complicated to work with it. But this looks good. I really like how this is looking. Now on the reference that this guy has, there's a couple of like flat surfaces over here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just add some masses. Think of this like if I was adding like blobs of clay onto the character. And then if we go to our scrape brush, we can just start flattening those masses. And due to the nature of the randomness that I added, we're gonna be getting this very interesting, like a rough shape. It's not gonna look perfectly smooth like a sphere. It's gonna be a little bit more like hammered or damaged. We're gonna get those sort of like interesting edges and that stylized look that we're going for. So see those like fragments that we're getting there? That's what we're going for. Now that we're working with secondary forms, we can start thinking about like those small details, those little things that really change the silhouette. And one of those elements is going to be definitely the teeth. So let's start working on the cavities where the teeth are going to be. So I'm going to make this smaller, and I know we're going to have even smaller. I have one cavity here, so let's carve in. These are definitely going to be like stylized teeth as well. Going to be quite big. I see our good friend here on the reference, he has like 4 or 5 of them. So let's add one more there, one more there. That means there's going to be like a little hole there, a little hole there, and then like a couple of like molars over here. So something like that, and we just carve. Now, on the back part, I mean, it's not that it doesn't matter, but again, if we're not going to see it as much, then it's not as important as the front part, which is going to be the most visible. We still want to do a little bit of work every now and then. Now, see how this thing is like really stretched out? This is where, again, Control R to remesh is a good idea to help the overall geometry relax a little bit more and get a more interesting result. Now, in between the teeth, like on this area right here, usually, not only do we have this sort of like ridges, there's usually some crevices as well. So again, with my sharp brush, I'm going to start like drawing this crevices right here going up. I'm always very scared of going to the dentist because it tends to hurt quite a bit. It's not a pleasant sensation, right? I had my wisdom molars or wisdom teeth pulled all at once in one session when I was younger. That was quite traumatic. So yeah, there we go. Now I do think these are a little bit too long, so I'm gonna bring them up a little bit. As you can see, I'm using the grab brush with a big size. Remember, whenever you're doing big changes, use big brushes. Whenever you're doing small changes, small brushes. I'm also gonna bring these guys or these things closer together, so that when I add the teeth, they don't go like flying to the side or something. Let's go back to our clay strips. And let's keep on polishing here. I constantly switch between using control and like the normal mode to add and remove volume. Again, the thing that I want to do is I want to build the basic, or in this case, the secondary shapes of the object. I'm going to carve in a little bit more there. You can carve in here, for instance. There's a big hole where the skull goes into the spine, and there's usually like a little bit of a bone here as well. So I'm gonna create a little that sort of thing. It's like the connection point. There we go. I do think we have a little bit too much volume on this thing right here. So again, let's just use our clay strip to get rid of some of that volume. That's also gonna make the eyebrows look a little bit more intimidating as well. And we need to polish this ones as well. Don't worry, we'll do that in just a second. Let's add a little bit more exaggeration. Since we're gonna go with this stylized effect, we can break some of the rules that we would normally have in realism, and we can go really crazy with a lot of stuff. So that when I was planning this course, that's why I thought it would be a good idea to show the stylization process, because it's also a little bit more gentle. You can have things that don't look quite as right, and since it's stylized, as long as they look proportionate and things like that, it should be just fine. There we go. I really like how this one is looking. think it's looking quite nice. The teeth do seem to be a little bit like on the weird side, so I'm gonna grab my grab brush again, especially the inner side here. I'm gonna push it up again. We need to be very careful about the front teeth, because on the front, this is where symmetry is more visible. So we need to make sure it looks as nice as possible. There we go. Cool. So I'm going to stop the video right here, guys. This is the next step that you need to get to, which is secondary shapes. As you can see, our elements looking nicer and nicer with each passing minute, and as long as we keep pushing and we keep polishing the things, it's gonna look, of course, even better. So on the next one, we're gonna talk about the tertiary forms, which in this case would be the teeth, and some extra things that we can start polishing here on the character before we jump onto the details. So hang on tight, keep on going, make sure you get to this point, and I'll see you back on the next video. Bye bye. Hey guys, welcome back to the next part of our series. Today we're going to continue with the tertiary forms, and that means, of course, that the teeth. There's a couple of things that we're going to be doing, but the teeth are, it's probably one of the most important parts. So, first of all, I want to use a little bit of my grab brush right here. Again, just press F and modify this thing a little bit, because from the front view, as you can see right here, it's not matching exactly as I would love. So, just a matter of tweaking and changing. See this thing right here? It's a little bit too far out for my liking, so I'm gonna make this thing a little bit bigger. Just push this in so that when we see it from the front, let's go right here. It matches the shape of the skull a little bit better. There we go. Something like that, I think, looks a little bit nicer. Now, how are we going to be adding the teeth? Well, there's a couple of different ways to do it, but I'm going to show you one that I think it's probably the easiest one. We're going to go back to layout, actually, and we're going to add a teeth as a separate entity. So in this case, I'm going to press Shift-A, Mesh, and I think a cube is a better shape to start with than a sphere. We're going to scale the cube down, pressing S, and then we're going to GY, and move it to the front. And at this point, since I want to do a symmetrical tooth or tooth first, I'm going to keep it right there at the symmetry line. I'm going to scale it in the Y or in C axis a little bit, so it's a little bit longer. And I'm going to scale it in the Y axis a little bit flatter like this. Now let's hide this one for just a second, the skull. By the way, it's always good to rename your stuff to keep things like clean. So let's call this teeth. We're going to hide the skull for just a second, and then we're going to jump into sculpting. Now, immediately, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to activate remesh, and this is going to remesh our stuff. You can see that it's already been remeshed because we have a lot more subdivisions right there. And with this, I think that's a good enough amount. This is another one of those like tips that I want to make sure you guys have, is you don't need to always have the same amount of subdivisions for every single object. Certain objects can be lower than others. Now, as you can see, I'm going to start beveling this upper part right here. Let me go back and turn on X symmetry. There we go. So we have both sides. And we're going to start flattening this thing right here. It's always a good idea to try and find the closest shape to the final like form or shape that you want, so that you do as little as work as possible, right? So in this case, a cube was way better than a sphere because it's already like quite like shaped like a teeth, right, or a tooth. Let's go here, and this one I'm definitely gonna bevel quite a bit more on the bottom side. Let's go to the other side. And that's it. We've successfully created the shape of a tooth. I'm gonna grab my move brush, or grab brush, and just make it a little bit wider there. When I grab this one again and just round this things off a little bit more. Okay, I don't want to make it sharp, but not super sharp. And that's it. Now, at any point, we can turn on the skull again, and it wouldn't be a good idea to move it here with the grab brush. So I'm gonna go back to layout, and in this case, let's go to number 1, G, and just position this where it's supposed to be, which is right around there. Let's press 3 to go on the number pad to go to the side view. G. We'll just have it right there. I am gonna rotate slightly. I don't want this to be like completely straight. Let's give it a little bit more alive, and something like that looks quite nice. Let's go to the like lower view right here. Let's press G, and let's rotate this on this one as well, so we get this sort of effect. And that's it. That looks quite nice. Now, how can we create the second piece or the second part of this element? Well, again, there's a couple of ways. We could, of course, just duplicate this and move it around and locate it. That's going to be asymmetrical, which is perfectly fine. But if we want to keep it on the same sort of like tool or element, I call it subtool because it's that's the way you call it in ZBrush normally. But if you want to keep it on the same object, you want to have the same object be this one, we can just go to the modifiers and say mirror. And we're gonna mirror along the x-axis, but remember that sometimes we need some sort of like something to tell. So we're gonna use the skull as our point, as our balance point. And as you can see, it's gonna take the skull as the center, and based on that x-axis, it's gonna duplicate it to the other side. Which right now, since we're aligned to the world, it should be exactly the same. And there we go. We have our very nice turd right here. Now remember, if you move one of them, the other one's gonna move as if it's mirrored. So that's very handy. I think I'm gonna push it up a little bit, and that's it. Now I'm gonna grab this one again. Let's press W to grab this one. Shift D, and I'm gonna move it to the side. And see what happens is, since we still have the modifier active, we're gonna be able to just duplicate this guy. We're of course gonna scale this a little bit smaller. Let's again go to our bottom view. Move it to where it's supposed to go. Rotate it a little bit. And that's gonna give us a very nice tooth right there. Let's scale it down a little bit more, and there we go. It looks nice. Looks a little bit what's the word? A little bit silly, right? But I think it's part of the stylized process. Let's keep on going. So I'm gonna grab this one, Shift D. Let's again go to our bottom view right here. Shift D. Just move this one right here. This one I'm gonna scale up a little bit. Rotate again. Shift D. Scale them because they're supposed to be closer to like the molars. Let's move them and Shift D, G, and move them back. Oh, let's go back to the C. There we go. Shift D, and that's it. Cool. So now we have a full like denture, or the full teeth that we might want to add. Here's where I would definitely go in and play around a little bit with the position of some of them. Like I don't want them all to be on the same exact position. Like that looks okay. And the most important thing is I kind of want them to look a little bit like more interesting, right? Right now, again, they look kind of silly, which is kind of expected. Whenever you only have the top part of the skull, they tend to look a little bit silly. But one thing that's definitely going to help is if I go to the side view and I grab all of the teeth and push them up a little bit like this, I think having them closer to the skull might make it better. Let's go back to the skull, and now let's go to sculpting, because moving parts of the skull in this position will be a little bit difficult. We're going to grab the grab brush again, and we're just gonna bring this thing up. There we go. It still looks a little bit goofy, but I think it's fine. Let's just keep pushing this, guys, so that we like properly like create the areas. There we go. That looks nice, right? Again, a little bit goofy, but it's not that bad. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Now what we definitely need to do is we need to start adjusting all of these areas right here so that it really looks like the teeth are coming from like a bony area. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna grab again my clay strips, and we're gonna make our brush a little bit smaller. Here's where I will probably bring my remeasure a little bit lower. So let's try 0.007 for instance, and let's do a remesh, because now we're working with tertiary details, so a little bit more resolution is justified. We're gonna bring this down, and as you can see, it's actually overlapping, but it doesn't look or won't look as it's overlapping as much because we have the other teeth right there. So let's just start filling some of these areas, and we want to create this sort of like triangular looking shape right here to create the root, like the root canals of the teeth. Definitely want to have like a little bit of a border. And we're gonna soften a little bit of this. It's always important to soften and clean up the forms, because this is gonna be like the it's gonna be the canvas that we're gonna be applying the details on top of. So that looks good. See how that looks a little bit nicer. There we go. Let's get rid of some of that, some of that. We just keep pushing all of these forms. Cool. Very good. So now our teeth are looking quite nice. At any point, I could go back to one of the teeth. Maybe I want to have like one missing tooth somewhere. So let's go back to, for instance, let's go to layout mode. Let's select this guy's right here, and I'm actually gonna delete the mirror. So I'm gonna just eliminate it. And what's gonna happen is we're gonna have one missing tooth right there, which looks funny. We could even go over here, for instance, like that one. Do we have a duplicate there? Oh, we do. Okay, so let's just delete that one. And I'm gonna grab this one, and here's what I'm gonna do. I am gonna delete one. Okay, I'm gonna delete the modifier, but I want this one to be the missing one, not this one over here. So how do we bring this one exactly to the other point? Very easy. If we go to object, we can actually mirror the object on X local or X global in this case. And oh no, I think it was X local in this case. Object mirror X local. That's really weird. I think we need to apply the transformations. So let's say Control A, apply all transforms. I'm gonna say object mirror and mirror X global. There we go. So now, as you can see, we're gonna have a missing molar over here and the teeth over there. So again, that's just a way to make things a little bit more interesting and add some, well, just cool looking features to the whole thing. Let's go now. Let's go back to like one of this, like maybe one of the front tooth is going to be chipped. That might be something that we want, right? Well, here's a little bit of an issue. Right now, these things are mirrored, so we can't as easily jump into sculpting, because if we do jump into sculpting and I start sculpting on one side, it's going to be on both sides. But if I turn off the symmetry, it's still going to be on both sides, because this thing right now is being affected by a mirror modifier. So what we need to do is we need to apply this mirror modifier so that this no longer are a copy or an instance of each other, but rather their own its own little like effect. Now that we have this, I'm definitely going to bring the this thing up. But see, here's one very cool problem. This also happens inside of other like sculpting softwares. Whenever you're remeshing something, if two objects are really close together, as what you're seeing right here, remesh, they're going to be welded together. You're going to weld both objects together. And that might not be something that you want. So what's the solution here? Well, there's a couple of them. First of all, we could separate these things. Like if we start smoothing these things out a little bit more, like there, and we try remeshing with a higher percentage of voxels or with a smaller voxel size, then that might be enough to avoid having any sort of overlapping. That's one of the first solutions. But the other solution might be, hey, maybe I want to have like a really dense density here because I want to write something, like add like a very specific detail. In that case, it's better to separate these guys into different like objects. And it's rather easy to do. I believe we've already done it with the rings on the barrel. So we're going to go back to layout mode. Let's there's an option right here. Let's just go to front view. There we go. I'm gonna go to edit mode. Okay, edit mode, and we're gonna select all of the faces on one side. It's very important that we do this on wireframe mode so that we are sure to select all of them. And we're gonna press P, which is separate selection. And now what's going to happen is we're going to have two objects, quite dense objects, by the way. They're going to be quite dense, but they're going to be separate objects. You can see this is teeth, and this is teeth 005. So that way, if we were to go back to sculpting, I'm going to be able to sculpt on this one without having to affect this one. As you can see, I'm not even sculpting. So yeah, that's the way to do it. Now, since we have quite a bit of resolution on this one, let's make use of that one, and let's start adding some interesting details. What about like a cracked tooth? I'm going to make this smaller. Let's set this very, very like interesting crack coming all the way from the root. It's kind of like a chip tooth going here. One thing we can do is we can add grab our clay strips. And what about like removing a little bit of or carving a little bit of damage here, right? Again, this is the sort of details that you're going to be adding to your stuff to tell a story, because anytime you have this sort of details, people are gonna wonder how did that character got that cheap tooth like this? Like, was it in a fight? Did he bite something that was way too hard or something? That's the kind of stuff that you want to add into your elements and into your compositions to create things that look a little bit nicer. Now let's jump back to the skull. So I'm going to activate the sculpting here. And what I want to do is I want to start creating this sort of like faceted detail that's very, very common in stylized work, where edges are a little bit harder than they would usually be. And I'm just going to be using the same brush that we've used before, this Scrape Peaks brush. So I'm going to start going over here. And this is now, we're jumping now into what I would call like the cleaning process, right? Like now that we are really sure that we have good primary forms, good secondary forms, and good tertiary forms, we can start going into this very, very cool polishing process. This is usually the process that takes the longest. It's not an easy process. It definitely takes some time, but it's the process that, as you are seeing right here, will give us this very, very, very cool effect. It's gonna sharpen, as you can see, all of the features here on the nose. I definitely want to create like a really nice sharp feature. I'm gonna bring my brush down a little bit more so we can start. It's kind of like carving and sculpting at the same time. As you can see, we can create this very, very nice pattern all around the character. Careful on the size on the brush. That's always going to be, it's going to tell you how big or how small this sort of like faceted divisions are going to look or going to appear. There we go. Even on the teeth, we can add a little bit of, you know, hardness. And look at that. Not bad, right? Not freaking bad. There we go. Yeah, I really like the overall look so far. Once we go into texturing, which by the way we are going to cover, this is going to look really, really nice because all of those hard edges, there's a very nice generator inside of Substance Painter that allows us to create it. Or to use that information, and it makes things look really, really clean, really nice. There we go. So as you can see, our stylized skull is looking quite nice. We're in a really good position. Now it's just time for us to jump onto the final part, which is the details. We're going to be adding some details to this thing, and we're going to obtain a couple of more fine-tuning elements. So hang on tight, and I'll see you back on the next one. Make sure to get to this point, by the way. This is the... I would suggest, if you're doing this, by the way, I know that I normally don't say this kind of messages at the very end, but if you are doing this and you feel like it's not looking as good as you might want, try starting over. I know that this sounds, it's very discouraging for me to be saying this, but sometimes when you start something over, you'll get better and better at it. This is, I've done, I don't know how many sculpts throughout the years, every time I teach ZBrush or sculpting or any type of organic way of creating elements, I do a sculpt. So I've been doing this for a long time, and that's why I can like get to a decent result in a relatively short amount of time. But if you're just starting, it's definitely gonna take some time. So be patient, push through, make sure to practice, and I'm sure you're gonna be able to create amazing looking things. So that's it for this one, guys. I'll see you back on the next one. Bye-bye. Hey guys, welcome back to the next part of our series. Today we're going to continue with the details of our skull. Let's save real quick before anything happens. Always save. And yeah, now it's time to start working in the details of this character right here, of this sculpture that we've been working on. So whenever I talk about details, I like to think about details in three big categories. In a very similar way as how we approach the basic shapes, I like to think of details in primary details, secondary details, and then tertiary details. I don't usually do like a video for each one of them, but I'm going to explain which or how I go about sculpting each one of the different elements. So the big details are those big elements that are going to be present pretty much everywhere. So with symmetry activated, I'm going to use my draw sharp. Let me bring this thing in. There we go. I'm going to use the draw sharp. Let's make this smaller. And we're going to start like creating the crevices. This would be normally on like skin and stuff, but it's fun to add this sort of like details on certain like hard surfacey effects like this skull. So every now and then we'll see this sort of like crevices or big like it's kind of like a wrinkles, right, on the character right here. For instance, here on the teeth, let's go even lower, like smaller. We're gonna start adding this sort of effects, going all the way in the surface. These are gonna give a lot of life to the whole sculpture. For instance, in traditional sculpts or in traditional skulls, you have certain seams. They're called stitches. So, for instance, we can add that sort of like stitching here on the nose, right? Like, let's keep it stylized and simplify. We can do this sort of effect right there. There's another one right about here, going into the eyes. Again, we can kind of like go around the eyes and separate the eye socket from the bones. Usually another one like right about there. I don't like that one, so I'm gonna not use it. There's usually one like right here. You've probably seen this ones, right? Like if you've seen a replica skull and things like that, you've probably seen this sort of things. I don't think it really like works as much or as nicely on this kind of like stylized sculpt. Maybe we go a little more stylized like that. That could work a little bit better. And if not, we'll just add like this sort of like cracks and wrinkles along the surface. I think it's gonna look good as well. There's usually a lot of like small little holes on the skull as well, which is through where the nerves come out and irrigate or irradiate throughout our face. But yeah, that looks good. I like it. I really like it. Now we need to talk about the next part of the detail, which is secondary details, right? Like those little like the damages, scratches, small little effects that now should be a little bit more asymmetrical. So I'm gonna get rid of this, and I do recommend going a little bit higher. So if we were at 0.07, let's go at 0.005 remesh, and let's remesh this. So we're going from 300,000. Let's see, to 600,000, so double the amount, right? Which is going to be great because now we're going to be able to add a little bit more detail. Again, we just removed symmetry, so now we can start adding like those effects. So for instance, let's add a little bit of like corrosion up here. I'm going to grab my clay one, and with control, I'm going to start carving a little bit of corrosion right here. See that sort of effect? Kind of like if the skull was getting rusted. And as you can see, I'm varying the intensity. I'm making smaller and bigger effects in certain areas. Let's do a little bit of that. Like over here, I really like the clay one because it's very round. It gives us this very round effect. Something I haven't talked about, but there's actually a brush palette that we can use for these things. It should be over here. There we go. Up here on this, on the top part of the properties, you're gonna see the clay, and these are all of the different things that we have: the hardness, auto smooth, the normal radius, strength. You can change these things around. Right now, as you can see, the hardness is quite high. That's why we're getting that very interesting looking, like soft effect on the skull. But if you want to minimize it, you can change it around by modifying that thing a little bit. There's also the stroke. Right now we're using the traditional stroke. We can add texture. We'll talk about this one later. But there's a lot of customization that we can do with the brushes. There we go. I'm going to go back to my draw sharp, and I'm going to start adding, you know, a couple of like scratches here and there. I'm going to increase the strength a little bit more. Something like that. I'm gonna keep it simple. I don't want to overdo it. It's like with everything in art, sometimes less is more. So keep it simple. Don't overdo it. Don't add more than we might need. And you're gonna get a sometimes you're more it's gonna look a little bit more like you chose where to have this sort of stuff. Now, there's one thing I haven't talked about, which are masks. Masks are a really good way to protect an area. Let's say we want to add a scratch here, like a big scratch around the eye, but I don't want to hit the inside of the eye socket. We can go here to the mask options and then just use our brush. I'm going to go with a really heavy strength, and let's go with a bigger size, and just mask out all of this area right here. And when we mask something out, that area is not going to be affected. As you can see there, I go across with my brush and nothing's going to be affected right there. There's a little bit of a radius on the outer side, so be careful there. But that way, I can start adding like a scratch right there and a scratch right here without really affecting any other parts of the skull. And to get rid of the mask is just a matter of, what's the word? You can just use, again, control to clean it up, for instance. It's one way to do it. Just clean the whole mask off. And that's it. As you can see, we're adding this very, very cool detail. If you feel like the detail is too much in certain areas, the scrape brush is a great brush to erase some of that detail without really removing the form. So we keep the form and we add more of this stuff. I would probably go into the teeth and add a little bit more detail as well. I think that would definitely help. But so far, I think this is a really, really good result. There's, of course, high frequency detail that we could add, like very, very, very small pores and things like that. But unfortunately, in order to do that, we will need to really increase the vertex count quite a bit. So I'm gonna, since we're going again through the stylized route, I think I'm gonna show you how to do that, but later on, once we get into the textures. If your computer can handle it and you wanna go like the extra mile and you wanna do like super small details, feel free to do it. Just keep in mind that the amount of polygons that you might need might be a little bit bigger. Actually, this might be a good idea or a good moment to talk about Dyntopo or Dyntopo, because this actually matches with what I'm about to, or what I was talking about. So let me explain what Dyntopo is. Dyntopo is a relatively new thing that they added into Blender that allows us to dynamically create topology as we need it. This is very similar to Sculptris, if you've used, again, ZBrush or Sculptris before. In order to do that, we need to activate it by clicking on this little square right here. It's going to probably give us a little bit of a warning. There we go. You cannot have both things at the same time, so you cannot remesh and have Dyntopo activated at the same time. It's either one or the other. You can jump between them, but you can't do them at the same time. So now with Dyntopo, what's going to happen, look at this. When I use my draw sharp and I start drawing, okay, it's going to start creating more topology or more density exactly on that side. It's going to be a little bit more easy to see with the snake hook. So if I grab the snake hook, for instance, and I pull this out, since I have Dyntopo like set up, when I smooth, see what's happening there? It's not actually, like it is smoothing, but it is creating new topology right there. Okay, so right now we have the detail set to 12 pixels. We can bring that detail down, and as we start drawing more and more points, it's gonna kind of like tessellate the object and create new topology. It's really handy when you're doing like super small details, but again, it is quite heavy. As you can see right here, right there we lost Dyntopo. Let's turn it on again. But we stop seeing the vertices and the triangles as they are, because they're gonna be dynamic. So as we add more detail, as we start modifying certain things, Dyntopo will change. I'm gonna bring this down all the way to 1 pixel, just so that you guys see how new triangles are going to be created the smaller my brush gets. So let's bring this down. There we go. So as you can see, I'm able to create very fine lines, very intricate detail here on my skull. And there's new triangles that are being created. Again, if we lower that resolution quite a bit, the computer is going to start struggling. But this is the kind of stuff that allows us to create a lot of detail without having to add resolution everywhere. It's only adding resolution to this specific portion of the element. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It's a nice little addition. We'll probably use Dyntopo a little bit more later on, but for now we're just going to keep working with remesher and multi-resolution divisions. And this is it, guys. If you've managed to get all the way to this point, then congratulations, you finished your first sculpture. You've already done your first model. We did the barrel. We actually sculpted the barrel as well. But now this is your first sculpture from scratch, from complete zero, from just a very single sphere. We were able to create this very nice looking stylized sculpt. We're actually going to be using this one for the final comp. You probably already saw it on the final element. There's a couple of more topics that we're going to talk about using this exercise, so make sure to finish it, because we are going to be texturing it, retopologizing it, so that we can cover some of the basics. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this one, guys. This is the end of chapter 2. As I mentioned in the first video, the first couple of chapters were going to be like a very basic introduction of the main things I need everyone to be up to speed with before we jump onto the project. So in the next chapter, we're going to start working on the body of our character, the main proportions, the blocking, and the anatomy of our character. Hang on tight, and I'll see you back on the next chapter. Bye-bye.